So tonight we are on, I believe it's lesson number 7, right? Okay. And we're talking about Jeremiah's ministry, his preaching, and reactions to his preaching. Now, our lesson number 6 was about God's judgment. And I don't know why I did this. I got a little crossways in my mind. I had another part to that lesson. I had another part to lesson 6, a part 2, that I intended to do. And somehow I just forgot about that, and I went ahead and created lesson number 7 and told you to prepare for lesson 7. So we're going to plow ahead through lesson 7, but then when we finish 7, I'm going to go back and finish part 2 of number 6, okay? I don't know what happened there. You know, you get to be my age. That's what the rest of you say. Why can't I use it? Okay, so
is this live? Are you streaming?
We're not streaming. We're recording, but we're not streaming.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, say it, Christine. What you got? What do you want to say?
Jimmy's at home.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to I have a comment, but if we're streaming, I'm not going to say it.
I said the camera. I don't know. He's like, I couldn't find it, so.
No, the only one that live streams is upstairs. All I want you to do for Sunday is read chapters 37 and 38. I don't have a handout for that, no questions. I just want you to read those 2 chapters. If you can do that in advance, that would help. Sandy, would you like me to pose, or you want me to? Yeah. Okay. All right. You see this? Don't worry about this right now. Pretend it's not up there. All right. So we're in chapter 20. Now, remember what we talked about on Sunday, where in chapters 18 and 19, we had that symbolic action where God told Jeremiah in 18 to go down to the potter's house and watch him make a vessel on the wheel, and he messed it up, and then he lumped the clay back together and started making something new. And all right, and then in chapter 19, God told Jeremiah to go and purchase a hardened clay jar, one that's already been thrown on the wheel and then fired in the kiln, and take that jar out in front of the people and smash it on the ground, and then make this prophetic announcement about the judgment that's going to come. In chapter 18 and verse 18, the people gave this response to Jeremiah where they slandered him and they maligned him. They unleashed this verbal attack on him. And in that context, we roll right into chapter 20. Because look at chapter 20 in verse 1. When Pashhur the priest, the son of Immer, who was chief officer in the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things. All right, you see how that just rolls right into chapter 20. He heard Jeremiah prophesying what things? Well, the things from chapter 18 and 19. This whole section forms a unit. So in chapter 20, Jeremiah faces persecution. He is beaten and he is put into stocks at the hands of this man, Pashhur the priest. Now, in chapter 20 and verse 1, we learn some things about this fellow Pashhur. We learn he's a priest, obviously. We see who his father is, the son of Immer. Now, I only point that out because I want you to turn the page and look at chapter 21. I don't want this to confuse you. Chapter 21 and verse 1, chronologically, is jumping far down the road. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord when King Zedekiah sent to him Pashhur, the son of Malchijah. That's a different man. It's the same name, but notice their fathers are different, all right? So Pashhur apparently was like George to the Jews, all right? It's a common name, okay? So, back to chapter 20, verse 1. This man, Pashhur the priest, is also the chief officer in the house of the Lord. He's the chief officer. This is something for you dig deeper people, and I think this is kind of interesting if you want to make this connection. If you go back to chapter 1 and verse 10, when God calls Jeremiah 1 and verse 10, he says, "See, I have appointed you this day over nations and kingdoms to pluck up and break down," etc. That expression, "I have appointed you," that's the same Hebrew word that's used in chapter 20 and verse 1 for chief officer. Okay? So Pashhur is an officer who's been appointed and chosen by men. Jeremiah is a man who has been appointed and chosen by God. All right? Same word is used in both places. And I think there's a tinge of irony here because Pashhur, who is this officer chosen by man, is persecuting Jeremiah, who is the man chosen by God. So Pashhur was an officer in charge of the temple. Well, what did he do exactly? We'll go to chapter 29. I'll show you an example of what someone in his position does. Chapter 29 and verse 24. "To Shemaiah the Neelamite you shall speak, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel." Okay, look at verse 26. "The Lord has made you priest instead of Jehoiada the priest to be the overseer in the house of the Lord." Okay, that's the same expression that's used of Pashhur in chapter 20 and verse 1. Overseer in the house of the Lord. Now, what does he do? He is the overseer in the house of the Lord over every madman who prophesies to put him in the stocks and in the iron collar. So Pashhur's job, along with this guy in chapter 29, Pashhur's job is to kind of police the temple area, all right? So he watches over all the goings on in the temple compound, and if anything gets kind of out of control, he comes in and he gets the rabble-rousers and he throws them in the stocks. And he disciplines them according to what it is they have done. So, being in the position that he's in, he has heard Jeremiah preaching. That's what it said in chapter 20 and verse 1, right? He heard Jeremiah prophesying these things. Of course he did. Jeremiah was often in and around the temple, preaching to the nation. And Pashhur is this officer in charge of keeping the peace at the temple. And not everybody likes Jeremiah. In fact, most people don't like Jeremiah. And so if you're Pashhur, every time you see Jeremiah come strolling into the temple compound, your radar kind of goes up and you're like, wonder what's going to happen today. All right? So, he hears Jeremiah preaching all of these things that he said in 18 and 19 about judgment, and Jerusalem's going to fall, and the temple's not going to be here anymore, and God's going to erase this place, and Pashhur doesn't like it. If all those things happen, he's out of a job. If all of those things happen, then the Jews' world falls apart. And so he clearly doesn't want that to happen. So he says, you know what? I'm going to make an example out of Jeremiah. So in chapter 20 and verse 2, he had Jeremiah the prophet beaten and put him in the stocks that were at the upper Benjamin gate, which was by the house of the Lord. Jeremiah is beaten and then he's put into stocks. Now, when you hear stocks, what do you think about? Do you picture the maybe the early American colonists and the criminal who's out there with his head in the wooden stocks? That's basically what this was. If that's what you're thinking, then you're in the right ballpark. Now, I don't know that it was shaped exactly like that, but it was this wooden shackle that bound your hands, your feet, and your neck. And as I understand it, it would force you to be in this awkward, contorted position where you'd be really uncomfortable. It was just like that, like that, right? You couldn't spend a whole lot of time there because your body would just, you become so uncomfortable. And that comes into play on verse 3, where it says, the next day, Pashhur released Jeremiah. I guess you didn't keep people in this position for very long. So, Jeremiah is suffering this physical persecution at the hands of this officer. Now, the next day, before I move on, where are these stocks? Did you notice that in verse 2? At the Benjamin gate, which is near the house. Yeah, it's public. This is right by the temple. Everybody who comes to the temple every day is going to see Jeremiah when he is there. This is a public thing. It's humiliating. He's to be made a public spectacle. So in verse 3, the next day when Pashhur released Jeremiah from the stocks, Jeremiah said to him, and from verse 3 through verse 6, Jeremiah gives this very specific prophecy about what's going to happen to this false prophet and false priest. Jeremiah gives him a new name in verse 3. Anybody want to take a stab at it? Magor make a mess of our pronunciation. All right, no. Magor Misaviv, all right, is the name that is given to him. What does your footnote tell you that means?
Literally fear on every side.
Fear, terror on every side, okay? This is an interesting expression. This is not a name in the sense that George or Fred or Alan is a name, all right? That's not what this is. This is actually just a generic term that Jeremiah uses several times in the book, actually. Let me show you just a couple of examples of that. Drop down to verse 10 in this same chapter. You see it repeated there. I've heard the whispering of many, terror on every side. Same word, same term is used. If you jump back to chapter 6 and verse 25, you see it there, talking about the enemy from the north, which we know is Babylon. Do not go out into the field, chapter 6, verse 25. Do not walk on the road, for the enemy has a sword. Terror is on every side. All right, you see this expression being used in a few different places. A couple of more. Chapter 46 and verse 5. 46, verse 5. Talking about Egypt and the judgment that they're going to experience at the hands of Babylon. It says at the end of verse 5, they have taken refuge in their flight without facing back. Terror is on every side, declares the Lord. And then last, chapter 49 and verse 29. Do you see that the way this is most often used, it's talking about a military conquest, one nation over another? You see that? 49:29, they will take their tents away and their flocks. They'll carry off for themselves their tent curtains, all their goods and their camels, and they will call out to one another, terror on every side. You also see it in Lamentations 2, I think in verse 2. This is not an unusual word for Jeremiah to use, is what I'm saying. Jeremiah uses this term half a dozen times or so, and he applies it to one man in chapter 20. It's used in a different sense in that it's applied to an individual and not a nation. That's something that the nation is experiencing. Oh, the Babylonians are here. There's terror on every side. Jeremiah says, Pashhur, what the whole nation will experience, terror all around, that's what you're going to experience. You're going to have the same fate as the nation. All right, so back.
Do you have any idea why the translators would use those two different, use fear on every side on one hand, and then this Magor and Misabib on the other? If it's the same word, why would they translate it differently?
Yeah, well, because my only guess on that, and it's a guess, I'd like to think it's educated, but my guess would be that while the Hebrew word would be used in all of those places, since it's spoken here to a person, it's almost as if, it's not almost as if, Jeremiah says God is giving you a new name. And so he uses the term itself here, whereas in the other places it's saying this is what all these nations are going to experience. It's not a name that's being given to them like it is here to an individual. Does that make sense?
It depends on the translation too. Two of my translations just have the phrase.
So in all those other verses that we looked up, did it have that Magor?
None of them do. It's always the phrase.
Yeah, and I think that's what Alan was saying.
I mean, even in this instance, it's the phrase.
Oh, instead of just putting a footnote in there that explains? Oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't consult different well, I did consult two, but not a whole bunch of them. That's the only guess I can give, Alan. All right, so back to chapter 20. Pashhur will no longer be this temple overseer who metes out punishments to others. Instead, he's going to be the one who receives the punishment from others. And it's going to be terrors all around. Jeremiah gives specific insight as to what's going to happen to him. And in verse 4 and 5, he talks about the sword and all these, exiles going to come, and the wealth of the city is going to be plundered. All this is going to be taken to Babylon. And then verse 6, you, Pashhur, and all who live in your house will go into captivity, and you will enter Babylon, and there you will die, and there you will be buried, you and all your friends to whom you have falsely prophesied. So not only is he a priest, verse 1, but he is also a false prophet. Jeremiah calls him in verse 6. Now, false prophets, we're going to have a whole lesson dedicated to them down the road a little bit. But the false prophets were just trying to say the opposite of what Jeremiah was saying. He's gloom and doom, and they're saying, hey, everything's great. Okay? So Pashhur wants to think and wants to believe that everything is great, but it's obviously not going to be that way. Now, after this experience where Jeremiah, who thus far has received verbal threats, chapter 18, we talked about that Sunday. He has had people in chapter 11 who have sought to devise plots against his life, but nothing came of it. So people have talked about hurting Jeremiah, but it isn't until this point that he actually experiences bodily harm. And this, it seems, proved to be too much for Jeremiah. This is when he got pushed to his limit. Because he says in chapter 20 and verse 7, this complaint to God, Lord, you have deceived me, and I was deceived. You have overcome me and prevailed. I've become a laughingstock all day long. Everyone mocks me. Each time I speak, I cry aloud. I proclaim violence and destruction. Because for me, the word of the Lord has resulted in reproach and derision all day long. My life is terrible. Every time I prophesy for you, bad things happen. And look, you've lied to me. You deceived me, God. Think about that now. We talked a little bit Sunday about that prayer that Jeremiah gave saying, God, make sure all their children end up, orphans, and make sure that their wives end up widows. And wow, that's strong language, right? So Jeremiah is just, he's exposing everything here. He's opening his heart up to God completely. God, you have deceived me. You told me you would be with me, that you would make me strong, right? Think back to chapter 1. You're going to make me a bronze pillar and a fortified city. And here I am getting beat up and thrown into prison and mistreated, and everybody's making fun of me. Why aren't you helping me like you said you would? So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to stop preaching. I'm just not going to do it anymore. So verse 9, but if I say, I will not remember him or speak any more in his name, I'm just going to take my ball and go home. You know, I'm going to go home and sit down and not go out and preach. But what does he say in the next expression? I can't do that. Yeah, we preachers love this verse, right? Because, we can wax eloquently on this. Jeremiah says, if I try to convince myself that I'm going to be quiet and not preach, I can't do it for long because I've got, the Word of God just burns within my bones and I can't keep it in. And I love that sentiment. I really love the way he says that. I'm weary of trying to hold that in. Now my question is, what made him so? Why was he weary of trying to hold that in and not share that message? And there may be a lot of answers to that. What do you think?
Sometimes we just have to let it out.
Well, what do you mean?
Vent.
Okay.
If we're struggling with something, sometimes we
Just got to get it off your chest.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We typically talk that way, though, when we're, kind of like Jeremiah, wanting to complain about something, right? Or gripe about something, which there's a little bit of that here. Is there any positive sense, though, in which Jeremiah says, I said I wasn't going to preach, but I just can't not do it? Is there a positive sense in which that could be true? If I don't go and say what God wants me to say, what's going to happen to all these people? I've got to warn them. I've got to give them a chance to repent, right? So I think there's a little bit of that in there. I think there is some of Jeremiah's devoted to his mission and his calling. I think some of that is in there. I think there may be different reasons why he says this, but I've always loved this this resolve that he has. I can't stop my prophetic work. I can't restrain myself from doing this. But clearly, Jeremiah is not in the best of places when he is offering this complaint. In chapter 20 and verse 10, he says, I have heard the whispering of many, terror on every side. This is what people are saying about me. And they say, denounce him. Let us denounce Jeremiah. All my trusted friends, literally all the men of my peace. Our friends should be people who seek our peace. They should be people who are sources of peace. And Jeremiah says, all the men of my peace, they're watching for my fall. And they are looking to prevail against me, and we might take revenge on him. His friends are saying this about him. But the Lord is with me. Therefore my persecutors will stumble and not. Do you see that contrast? Everybody hates me, but the Lord is with me. And so then he calls upon God to fight for him and show God's vengeance in verse 12. In verse 13, he says, let's sing praises to the Lord, for he's delivered the soul of the needy one from the hand of the... all right, so now we've gone from complaining, bitterness, life is bad, everybody hates me, and we've turned positive here, right? You see that shift? Verse 14, cursed be the day when I was born. Whoa! Wait a minute. What happened? Cursed be the day that I was born. Let the day not be blessed when my mother bore me. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, saying, a baby boy has been born to you, and made him very happy. Well, wait a minute. What happened? And obviously we can't say this with certainty, but there's a lot of people who think that some time has elapsed between 13 and 14. And I think that's possible. I don't think Jeremiah is bipolar and just he's this one second and he's something completely different the next. I think what this is showing us is the wide range of feeling that Jeremiah has. The wide range of emotions that, I mean, he's on a roller coaster here. He really is.
I think he's human.
Yes, yeah. And Alan talked about that on Sunday. Jeremiah is expressing the same kinds of expressions that we would if we were facing the same conditions that he was. Kyle, did you have your hand up a minute ago?
No, it's okay. I sort of did, but it's good.
All right. Okay.
End up,
Can I say one thing? I remember several years ago, I was having a conversation with an older preacher, and I was just asking him a little bit, I didn't know him all that well, and I asked him what it was that got him into preaching. You know, and he'd been preaching for many, many years, you know, and he said, well,
It's the women.
yeah, and he said, you know, you don't get into preaching because you have to. You get into preaching because you have to.
Yeah.
And so if you understand what he meant,
Yep.
when he said that, that might sound contradictory, but
Right.
There's a lot of truth in that. There is just something in you that won't let you do anything else.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I was looking over at the Corinthians where I thought the verse was, but there, and someone could help me out with this, but at some point in the book of Corinthians, Paul says, woe unto me if I do not preach the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where that is, but there is that.
Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians 9.
Inside some people that they just can't do anything else.
Yeah, I think it's 1 Corinthians 9. I had a preacher say to me one time, we were having that same conversation, and he said about preaching, not 9:16. He said, well, don't do it if you can keep from it. Right? And let me think about this before I get it wrong. There's a statement that's been used by I don't know, millions of preachers, I guess. Let's see, there are three types of preachers. There are those who have something to say. There are those who have to say something. You don't know what he's going to say, but he's going to get up and he's going to talk. He has to say something. There are those who have something to say. Men who have studied and they're thoughtful and they've got good things to share. And then there are those who have something to say and they have to say it. Right? And that's what Jeremiah was. He was that third one. All right. I'm going to pay for that comment about getting into preaching for the women. I should have said the money. That's what I should have said. All right. Chapter 26. Let's go there. Jeremiah's second temple sermon. His first temple sermon was in chapter 7. And I don't want to give the impression when I say his first and second temple sermon that these are the only two occasions that he ever preached at the temple. I don't think that's right. I think he was in and around the temple oftentimes. But on these two occasions, God explicitly said to him, go to the temple and preach. Okay? So we have two occasions where that is the situation. So chapter 26, verse 2, the Lord says, stand in the court of the Lord's house. Go to the temple, preach. So he goes and he talks about the judgment that's going to come in the first 6 verses. I'm going to skip over that. Let's get to the reaction in verse 7. The priests and the prophets, that's the false prophets that he was speaking against all the time. The priests and the prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah speaking these words in the house of the Lord. When Jeremiah finished speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to the people, the priests and the prophets, and all the people seized him, saying, you must die. I've never had that happen to me. Maybe because I'm not preaching the same things Jeremiah was preaching. But the people grab him, they want to kill him, And they say in verse 9, basically, why are you saying all this bad stuff about us? You deserve to die because of these things that you're preaching. I want you to think about why they react this way. Well, they don't like it. Well, yes. But understand that the things Jeremiah was saying were going to happen, the people thought was impossible. What do you mean we're going to be destroyed? Hey, Jeremiah, you see that huge building you're standing in? That's God's house. It's still here, which means who's in it? God's in it. And as long as God's in the house and the house is still standing, the walls are still standing, we're good. You see, they thought this was impossible. Therefore, if what he's saying is impossible, he's a false prophet. And what do you do with false prophets? You kill them. So, in verse 10, court comes into session. Court is convened to render a legal judgment about the matter. And in verse 11, the charge against Jeremiah is laid out. Well, not the charge so much as the desired outcome. We want a death sentence for this man. So in verses 12 through 15, Jeremiah gives a defense of himself. And I want to focus on verse 15 where he says, "Know for certain that if you put me to death, you will bring innocent blood on yourselves and on this city and on its inhabitants. For truly the Lord has sent me to you to speak all these words in your hearing." So in verse 16, I think what you have in 16 is the final judgment that's rendered about Jeremiah. The officials, the people, said to the priests and the prophets, "No death sentence for this man, for he has spoken to us in the name of the Lord our God." That's the result of the court proceeding. Verses 17 through 24 explain how verse 16 came to be. Does that make sense? So you get the end of the story at the beginning. You follow me? Mary Gail, you looked at me kind of puzzled. Verse 16 is the conclusion that they arrived at. 17 through 24 shows you how they got there. All right? So, verse 17 tells you who came together. Some of the elders of the land rose up and spoke to all the assembly of the people. So you've got elders, you've got all the people who are around the temple that day. You've got the prophets and the priests who are there. And there are two situations, historic situations that are brought up to help them figure out how they should handle Jeremiah. Verse 18, some of the elders say, "Micah of Moresheth," that's the same Micah whose book bears his name, the minor prophet. "Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. And he spoke and said, 'Zion will be plowed as a field and Jerusalem will become ruins.'" Micah spoke up a long time ago in the days of Hezekiah. He too prophesied judgment upon Judah. But we didn't kill him. Hezekiah didn't order him to be executed. In fact, Hezekiah listened with a tender heart, and the nation repented because of what Micah preached. So you've got a portion of the elders of Judah saying, "Hey, guys, remember Micah, what happened? Don't kill Jeremiah." It turned out good for us then because we didn't kill God's messenger. If we don't kill this messenger, maybe things will turn out good for us. That's argument number one. Argument number two comes when other of the elders of the people speak. In verse 20. "Indeed, there was also a man who prophesied in the name of the Lord, Uriah, the son of Shemaiah from Kiriath Jearim, and he prophesied against this city and against this land words similar to all of those of Jeremiah. And when King Jehoiakim who, by the way, if you jump back to chapter 26 and verse 1, who's the king at the present day when Jeremiah is preaching? It's Jehoiakim, same guy. So this prophet Uriah, he didn't live long ago like Micah did. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah. And he also spoke in the name of the Lord, the same kinds of things that Jeremiah was speaking, and King Jehoiakim hated him, just like he hates Jeremiah. Verse 21, when King Jehoiakim and all his mighty men heard his words, the king sought to put him to death. But Uriah heard it, and he was afraid, and he fled and went to Egypt. Jehoiakim sent men to Egypt to go and get him. And what's the word? Extradite and bring him back and punish him. In verse 23, they brought Uriah from Egypt. They led him to King Jehoiakim, who slew him with a sword and cast his dead body into the burial place of the common people. So you've got some of the elders saying, hey, listen, Micah, we didn't kill him, and Hezekiah's life was extended, and the nation did better, and let's not kill Jeremiah. Well, yeah, but there was this other prophet named Uriah, and Jehoiakim hated him, and we got rid of him because he was like a fly that kept buzzing around our head, and we needed to get rid of him so we could finally be at peace. Jeremiah is an instigator, just like Uriah was. We need to get rid of him. So you've got a divided group. So what happens? Verse 24, the hand of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, was with Jeremiah, so that he was not given into the hands of the people to put him to death. Ahikam, son of Shaphan the scribe. You remember that name? Ahikam is apparently in some kind of capacity where he can render the verdict and determine what happens. He's a friend to Jeremiah, just like all of Shaphan's family. And I don't have time to go through this chart. I'll go through that Sunday. But Ahikam renders that Jeremiah should be acquitted and released. And that's what happens. All right. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. We're going to do an exciting family tree on Sunday. All right, we'll start with the family tree, and then we'll get into chapters 37 and 8. All right, we've got at least one more, probably two more lessons on Jeremiah's preaching and reactions to it, because his book is full of these kinds of exchanges that we've talked about tonight. So we're gonna spend probably 3 class periods on that. Roy, you don't have to do that. No, you're welcome to do it. Okay, any questions about anything we talked about tonight? I know that this class is more lecture than it is back and forth, and that's not typically the way that I like to do my classes. But do you agree with me that for most people, the prophets are kind of this dark, nebulous hole where we're all kind of, in this wasteland where we're not exactly sure what to do with them, and maybe lecture's not all that bad when we come to the prophets? Yeah. Okay, all right. Well, that's kind of what I thought maybe we needed, but I'm always happy to open it up and speak less. Thank you, everybody.